on March 8th at 4 o'clock, where you'll have a chance to hear from Katie Ron and Mackenzie Grayson. They'll be presenting a session entitled Fostering Family Well-Being, Building Two-Generation Approaches. And there will be an RSVP for that speaker event in the chat, so you can click and add your name to be included. Today, St. Louis University School of Education and the Office of the Vice President for Research are pleased to introduce our speaker, Candace R. Kuby, PhD. Dr. Kuby is a professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri. She serves as the department chair and the director of qualitative inquiry. She received her PhD in literacy, culture, and language education from my alma mater, Indiana University. And she previously taught primary grades in US public schools and preschoolers in Japan. I first became aware of Dr. Kuby's work during a national conference presentation while she was still a graduate student. She'd been exploring photo voice as a collaborative inquiry experience inspired by feminist theory. And then later at another conference, she introduced me to the notion of thinking with theory, which I found equally compelling. I've been following her work closely since then. In this session, Dr. Kuby focuses on speculative pedagogies inspired by post-philosophies, specifically how philosophical concepts inspire the doing of inquiry and the teaching of inquiry in higher education. Drawing on work that she shared in a recently co-authored book, Speculative, yes, I do have a dog in the background, Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry. Today, she's going to share examples from two threads of her research. The first is the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools. And the second thread is the approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. At the end, we'll open up space to entertain questions about the presentation as well as the suggested readings that she provided for us ahead of time. Please keep those questions coming in the chat and we'll open up that discussion at the end of Dr. Kuby's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Kuby, for joining us today, and others guests, if you'll please join me in welcoming her to our program.
Yay. Thanks so much, Catherine. What a beautiful introduction. You brought me back to our first encounters around photo voice and then, our future encounters that happened after that. So thank you so much for those memories. Hello to all. It's so great to be with you today. I hope you're staying warm and safe, whether you have snow or sleet where you are, if it's coming down. Thanks for your flexibility to pivot to an online format instead of hybrid. Little nervous about driving today and getting stuck somewhere on I-70, so I appreciate your flexibility. I saw in the chat, I have a child home from school and my kitchen is getting remodeled, but we've asked for all the hammering and the taking down of walls to stop for an hour. So I'm hoping that you can hear me, but this is life right now in an ongoing pandemic and with winter weather. So I'll do my best. Might have to mute if it gets a little noisy. I would love to just know who's here today. If you don't mind in the chat, introducing yourself, maybe let me know kind of your discipline home or your area of expertise as a scholar. That would just help me to know who's in the room, so to speak. So we'll pause for a moment. I know you probably know each other, but you are all, almost all new faces for me. So I love seeing the range of areas of expertise here. Also people admitting that I'm mostly quant, and that's great. I love having conversations across methodological traditions. So that is welcome. Glad you're here. You have medicine represented. All right, so a lot of areas of expertise. That should make our conversation really fun today. Catherine, if you don't mind, I'm happy if you want to, Catherine has my slides to be able to share screen with you all. So if you don't mind doing that. Actually, that's the one for this afternoon. Can I do the other one, Catherine? That's the one for the graduate student. So I'll switch to the other one for this lecture.
Think lofty thoughts and fill the space a moment while I pull that. Apologies.
I'm still reading those areas in the chat box, so that's okay. And it looks like we do have some students here, doc students, PhD candidates, welcome as well. And as Catherine's getting it up, but yes, I encourage you, if you have questions throughout, to go ahead and post them while you're thinking about them in the chat. And Catherine is happy to help curate and moderate that when we get to the Q&A, but feel free to put them there anytime so you don't forget them.
Okay, I have it. I just need to download it so that it's easier for people to see.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so I'll do a little bit to just get started, and when you have it ready, then that's fine. So as Catherine said, I have two areas of research interest, and I thread them together under the umbrella of relational pedagogies. I'm really interested in philosophical concepts that help us think about how learning and teaching come to be in different spaces. And so as Catherine shared, one of my threads is really looking at the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools. So I'll spend a little bit of time today sharing around my scholarship in that area. And then second, which will become kind of the main focus of our talk today, is about how we teach and prepare people to be inquirers in the world, in the academy, and how we prepare our students. And so really looking carefully at approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry. For me, I do this work thinking with different post-structural and post-humanist concepts, which I'll share about today. But I also invite you to just think more broadly about your own teaching, your own areas, and how some of the ideas might spark connections, spark questions for you, especially across methodological traditions. And Catherine also mentioned, if we want to go to the second slide, that there were a few suggested readings, and there's by no means do you have to have those read for our talk today, but I think that they're available to you if you want to be able to find them later.
Candace, can you check and make sure that I have the correct one? Because they both
do.
All right, good. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, if you want to go to slide 2, maybe just using the arrow on the right side there. That way you don't have to scroll up and down. Oh, wait, that's the other one though. That's interesting.
Yep. Okay. I'll give it one more shot here.
Okay. I'm not sure. Is it able to be downloaded?
They're both coming up the same, which is kind of scary. Okay, so I'm going to just show from here and see if this works. Okay,
that sounds good.
Yay, my technology skills are just so phenomenal. Okay.
All right, yeah, just do it like that. That'd be great. Yep, we'll be right there. All right, can people see that? All right, maybe thumbs up, shake your heads. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, so a little backstory to my research over the years. And so I'm using book covers kind of to give an overview of my journey to kind of get a broad picture of my scholarship. The first one on the left really was my dissertation work when I was at Indiana University, and it was focused on me being back in the classroom and teaching 5- and 6-year-old children in Alabama. I'm an Alabama native. And there was a summer program that I spent teaching one summer and exploring what it sounds like and looks like to talk with young children about power, position, and privilege in the world, specifically around race. It was a very autoethnographic piece as well, exploring my own histories and biases and privileges and why that matters in our pedagogies as teachers. The second book we'll spend more time on today. It's called Go Be a Writer. And this is a collaboration, a piece co-authored with a teacher, Tara Gutschall-Rucker. We've been partnering together since I came to Mizzou in 2010, and she's taught kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 5th grades. And this is a piece that came out of our years of thinking around literacies, how they come to be in the classroom. We drew upon post-structural and post-humanist concepts and conceptualized this idea of literacy desiring, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then the third image is an edited collection from scholars all over the world thinking about posthumanism. What is it? What does it mean or do or produce for literacy education? And so this is a very artful, playful collection that we invite readers in to really kind of disrupt their thinking or thoughts about what is literacy and how we conceptualize it, as well as how do we go about teaching it. All right, next slide. And then this is an edited special issue in the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy. And this was an exploration to really think about how posthumanist theories inform pedagogies, but also our methodologies as scholars. And again, it's a great edited collection with people from all over the world that are thinking about these philosophies and theories in particular contexts. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this partnership with Tara Gutschall-Rucker. Like I said, we've been working together for over 10 years. And I think one thing that's really important about our partnership, I think she would say this, is that it is very much a co-partnership. We analyze data together, we read theory together, we write together and co-author together, and we really learn a lot from our partnership with each other, as well as the students in her classrooms over the years. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, in our book, Go Be a Writer, we draw upon a range of philosophical concepts and the data and experiences from her classroom to conceptualize this notion called literacy desiring. Desiring is really borrowed from Deleuze and Guattari's writing on desire. And the way that we define literacy desiring is this: literacy processes, so the becoming of artifacts such as books, movies, dramas, 3D models, wall murals, puppets, and so forth, and to emphasize the fluid, sometimes unintentional, unbounded, and rhizomatic ways that multimodal artifacts come into being through interactions with humans and non-humans. So things like time and space and materials and the environment. Literacy desiring is oriented toward the present, ever-changing needs, wishes, and demands of students with non-humans, but also with possible users of literacy artifacts in mind. So our thinking in this book really was an inquiry or exploration that really had us asking a very ontological question: what is literacy, or what is writing? And how do things like time and space and materials, in this case, a classroom space, really matter in what comes to be and what counts as literacies? Also, a very intentional focus on the present. I think often in literacy scholarship, we talk about audience and writing to some future that may or may not come to be. But for us, we were really interested in the moment, in the now, and the processes of literacies coming to be. Next slide. So in the book, we outline 8 concepts that we use to think with throughout the examples from her classroom. I'll go over them briefly, just to kind of give you some context. The ones on the left side, we categorize as post-structural concepts coming from different post-structural philosophers. The ones on the right might be classified more from post-humanist philosophers. Of course, that's not so easy to draw those two lines between those two schools of thought. But one that really inspired our thinking about literacies is Deleuze and Guattari's notion of rhizomes and lines of flight. So if you're familiar with the root structure of a rhizome plant and how it spreads apart, it has spurs that goes in lots of different directions under the ground, and it's quite unpredictable and also hard to get rid of. That was a concept that we thought with. Assemblage of desire is thinking about the processes of desire coming to be, not so much an end product. Smooth and striated spaces were really helpful for us. Deleuze and Guattari talk about these as not so much binaries, but both are needed. When they talk about smooth spaces, Deleuze and Guattari invite you to think about things like the ocean or the desert that's quite wide open and movement can happen in many directions, where striated spaces are like the blocks of a city, the concrete buildings that force our bodies in certain directions. And so again, they argue that we need both. And so we really played around with this notion of smooth and striated when we were thinking about pedagogy and curricular decisions in the classroom. The fourth concept here is silences or absent presence. This comes from the philosopher Derrida. and talking about things that might seem absent in a space, but are actually quite present, or things that are silent or overlooked in classroom spaces that we might not draw attention to, but really matter in the relationships and the pedagogies that are coming to be. On the right-hand side, you'll see 4 additional concepts. Intra-activity might be a new word for you. It comes from a feminist philosopher, physicist, actually, Karen Berard. And Karen plays around with the word interaction, spelled INTERACTIOM, to really talk about interaction as a relational way that humans, non-humans come to be in the world. And then enacted agency is another concept from Berard that talks about agency not located in an individual person or object, but that actual agency happens in the in-between relationship between objects and people. Entanglement is also related to that. This notion helped us think about student subjectivity and their identities and how they come to be in very entangled relationships. And then the final concept that we thought within the book is the notion of becoming. And again, in post-structural, post-humanist scholarship, it's very much a focus on the present and how the past and the future influence our in the moment becoming in the world. So this is just a brief overview of the 8 concepts in the book. You'll hear me probably talk some about these and other pieces and manuscripts that we'll get into a little bit today. So I wanted to just give you a few examples from the book so you can kind of see the things that we explored in her classroom space and the ways that we were thinking about pedagogy, the uncertain kind of messy thinking around teaching. So in the book, we divide the chapters up around genres of writing. And one of our chapters, we focus on personal narratives. And so you can see here a couple examples how she invited students to create personal narratives with artistic and sometimes digital tools that looked very different than the traditional alphabetic essay or writing. The one on the left is Bye Bye Birdie's game board. This was a combination of 2 students working together. Actually, I should pause. This is a nonfiction example, not a personal narrative, but it was a nonfiction research project where they researched cats and the other student researched birds, and they came together to create a game board that had information to teach their peers about the not so friendly relationship between cats and birds. And so you can see the game board there on the left. The one on the right is an example of a personal narrative. Again, she invited students to think about personal narratives and how could you create something that someone could use that would help them understand this personal event in your life. And so you can see here revisions. So this looks a little different than maybe our normal way of thinking about revision. The image on the top is pipe cleaners, stickers, some tape and paper that the student tried to create their house to help students understand about a sleepover they had with their friends. These materials did not work the way the student expected. And you can see the bottom image happened after several revisions, working with different materials to create a 3-dimensional house. It also had some script cards and some characters that students could actually play in the house to learn about what happened during the sleepover. The next slide is an example from the chapter in the book around fiction writing. And this one's I don't expect you to be able to read what's on the page, but it was an example of 3 students who over several months spent time co-authoring chapter books that were inspired by the Chronicles of Narnia, but kind of a modern twist with technology. And it was a really beautiful relationship to see 3 second graders take these drafts home at night to set up partnerships of writing, and they're actually in bed at night when they were supposed to be asleep. And we had a lot of fun writing this chapter because we wrote it as fiction ourselves. And so it was a really fun way to try to show what fiction writing might look like from empirical data. And then the last slide here comes from perhaps our favorite chapter in the book. We really drew upon Derrida's notion of absent presence. And so we were looking for multimodal kind of literacy artifacts and events in the classroom that might not get labeled as writing, might not get labeled as literacies, but that we really saw a lot of language and literacies happening. And so our final chapter in the book really is a space that shocked our own thought and made us really start thinking more deeply about what gets to count as literacy. And as teachers, if we say no to certain literacy practices? What does that not allow in the classroom space? So you can see the top image looks like math manipulatives or math cubes, which they are. But this was a place where students were creating personal narratives about a swimming pool party. So you can see the blue cubes and a slide and lots of little people that were created, and the stories and the oral language that happened around these cubes really gave us a space to pause and think about pedagogy. And on the bottom is an example of a skateboard park ramp. So you can see two little skateboards on the right, and you can see the way that some students folded and used paper and string to create a skateboard park, and probably a little embellished from the real one that they engage with in their community. But again, personal narratives and fiction and imagination all combined together here. So these are just some examples from the book. And so I'll give a few insights that Tara and I had from writing this book, and that's on the next slide, Catherine. So kind of a big overview of kind of the insights or the so what's that we were left thinking about as we collaborated on this research project. The first one is that we went into the project thinking about these 8 post-structural and post-humanist concepts, and really thought that they would be inspiration for our inquiry or our methodological approach, which they were. We really did, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning, think with theory. We think with these concepts in relation to the data that happened from the classroom. But what we found over time is that these theoretical concepts did inform our methodology, but just as much informed the pedagogical decisions. And so we see these 3 as kind of a mutually constitutive relationship. The other thing that we thought a lot about in this book were these words on the next bullet: time, space, material, trust, and permission. It was kind of the themes that we found ourselves talking about the most, mainly about trust and permission, that children literally looked to Tara, they looked to me to see if they were going to be allowed to be literacy learners in the ways that we were inviting them to be. The next is perhaps also a new word or concept, ethico-onto-epistemology. This is a central component of post-humanist philosophy. It's the idea that ontology, or our being in the world, epistemology, our knowing, and then ethico, or related to axiology, or our doing and relationships in the world, cannot be separated. And so this was a concept that we thought a lot about in how we considered pedagogical moves. Another thing that came from this project was just our notion of planning in order to be flexible, and how pedagogy is quite uncertain, unpredictable, and that we had to plan, but at the same time be surprised by what came to be in the relationships in the classroom. And then, like I've mentioned before, we did a lot of thinking about what is literacy, what is writing. And the last 2 I'll share examples with around representation and the rhizomatic writing process on the next slide. And so we did a lot of playful thinking about how we represent what unfolded in the classroom in 2-dimensional transcripts. And so you can see here, while we included talk from humans, we also did playful thinking around time and the amount of pauses or silences and interactions, as well as the actual materials of the classroom. In this example, you'll see a Post-it note, and we were trying to represent how it fell to the floor during this interaction that the students were writing around. And the final one on the next slide from the book is just this notion of a writing cycle. Our work together has really forced us to think about the way that this can be taught or thought about as a linear process or kind of a cycle. You can see on the left Tara's writing, where she had talked to students about the process of brainstorm, draft, edit, revise, publish, and share. And you can see on the right a student actually showing me one day her own writing process for just one day of writing time in the classroom. And on the left, you can see different colors of markers that Tara used when different children voiced their own writing processes. So you can see how messy, how students go in between these different components, and not always in a very linear, cyclical fashion. So that's kind of a big overview of our work together. And I just wanted to touch for a moment on this suggested reading that comes from my partnership with Tara. And it happened several years after the book that we co-authored together was published. And it really, I think, is a good focus for today's talk. This one really focuses on the doing of inquiry. And you can see by the title, Reimagining Multiliteracies Research Practices with Post-Qualitative Inquiry. And so you might be wondering, what is post-qualitative inquiry? It might be a new concept for you. Post-qualitative inquiry was coined by Elizabeth St. Pierre, who's at the University of Georgia. And she came to this title when she also was thinking with different post-structural concepts and realized that as she thought with these concepts, they were in contradiction or they didn't seem to work with the traditional qualitative research methods and practices that she had been trained in. And so she writes that the post-qualitative inquirer does not know what to do first and then next and next. There is no recipe, no process. This is truly experimental inquiry, attending to the surprises that point to difference and refusing the impoverished answers we've given to the questions the world has posed. If one has read and read, for example, post-structural or post-humanist philosophy, one cannot not put theory to work. It will happen. The post-qualitative inquirer must prepare herself to trust herself and do the next thing, whatever it is, to experiment and keep moving. So that's an invitation that can be quite scary, not only for academics, but also our students who are learning to be inquirers in the academy. But I want to show a couple of examples from this chapter, which you have and can read a little bit further. So on this slide, you'll see a few more examples from Tara's classroom from nonfiction research that I think with as I write this chapter to really illustrate different ways of approaching inquiry. You'll see an octopus here, you'll see a panda, and you'll also see a jellyfish from several second graders. The next slide shows you kind of an outline of the chapter and what I explore in the chapter. And so the first part of the chapter, I really try to articulate what or how I understand post-qualitative inquiry, what assumptions kind of ground this notion of post-qualitative inquiry. And I talk through 4 in the chapter, this notion of new empiricism and resisting binaries. So resisting binaries is really important in post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. If we think about binaries such as mind and body, or man and woman, or nature, culture, these binaries are how our world is set up, but that we can work to resist those and find very fruitful and generative ideas and relationships if we work kind of within those binaries. I also write about non-representational logic and how these philosophies help us to think about language and representation. I also talk a little bit about how these philosophies shift the way I think about subjectivity, not residing in individuals, but in our relationships coming to be. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of ethico-onto epistemology. The second half of the chapter, then, I take these nonfiction examples from Tara's classroom and put them to work with 4, I would say, analytical practices that I have found helpful as I've tried to figure out what does it mean to do inquiry with these philosophies. One is also what Catherine mentioned earlier, this idea of thinking with theory by Jackson and Matsei. The second comes from Deleuze and Guattari's writing around to think is to experiment. The third, also inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, is this notion about creating concepts. And the last is a practice that Karen Berard writes about from physics, the notion of diffraction, but how people are taking that up as a methodological tool as well. So I want to shift gears here at the end toward how these research inquiries that I had with Tara around pedagogies and early and elementary classroom spaces really inspire my own teaching in higher education. As Catherine mentioned, I serve as the director of qualitative inquiry for our College of Education and Human Development, and my minor during my PhD program was focused on critical inquiry and qualitative research. So for me, I'm quite interested in the how do we train and prepare our graduate students to become inquirers? And so for me, it's situated in the tradition of qualitative inquiry, but I know we have people here today that identify more from a quantitative perspective or even mixed methods. And so you might think about what does it mean maybe to invite a place of speculative pedagogy within any of the courses that you find yourself teaching in. So on the left here, you'll see an edited collection called Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry. And this was really the second book I published, probably around 2013 or 14. And it was a collection of a few of us, Ruth Nicole Brown and Rosanna Carducci, really thinking about when we were teaching qualitative research classes that often the textbooks are quite traditional. and the approaches that they share, but we had students interested in what might be labeled as non-dominant or disruptive, such as arts-based approaches, or what Catherine mentioned earlier, photo voice, different feminist and critical approaches to work, to research, and even like participatory or action research approaches. And so this is a collection of scholars. Many of them were quite new, either PhD students or emerging into their first few years of their professorship, that we pulled together to help us think about some non-dominant disruptive approaches. The second book is my most recent, which I'll spend most of today talking about, and it's this idea of speculative pedagogies. All right, on the next slide, I will just share a couple of other resources if you're interested. So this is an edited collection in the journal called Qualitative Inquiry. And myself with Jasmine and Becky pulled together people who are in higher ed and who are teaching about qualitative inquiry to have them tell us, what does pedagogy look like for you? What is produced when we're thinking with different either post-structural, post-humanist, sometimes indigenous philosophies, feminist philosophies? What does that produce for how we teach? So if you're interested, I would encourage you, you can find this in the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry. But to focus our remaining time today, I want to turn to the next slide. This is one of the suggested readings that I shared with Catherine. And this might seem like maybe a surprise to think about textbooks, but as the title shares here, the matter we teach with matters. So if we think about the non-humans, the objects in our classroom space really matter. And the subtitle is Teaching with Theory, Theorizing with Textbook Bodies. And so this article came from a partnership with Becky. Since 2015, I have been soliciting IRB approvals from students in my classes. And then after grades are submitted and the semester's over, conducting focus groups to really figure out what was produced for them in the classroom and to help me improve my own teaching, but also to share this more widely in the academic community. And so this article really looks closely at the textbooks that we chose and why they matter. On the next slide, you'll see images of 3 textbooks that we selected for this particular semester of teaching an introductory qual research class, so like a qual 1 class. On the left, you'll see a book called Reconceptualizing Qualitative Research. This book is very poetic in how it's written. It might be considered it's informed or influenced by Mirka's understandings of different post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. The one in the middle is one that I did edit and talk about earlier. And then on the one on the right is what might be seen as a more traditional textbook that really covers kind of the basic or kind of the big 5, Creswell 5 traditions like phenomenology, ethnography, narrative, etc. And so we were intentional as we created the syllabus to put these books in conversation with each other and make tensions very visible. So kind of to rub these ideas up to one another as students were just beginning to learn about qualitative research. And you can see some questions there and statements on the slide that you might think about that we were really, that really came for our work together. One is that matter matters, the literal matter in the classroom, like our textbooks and readings that we choose, is really important in what becomes in the classroom. We also realized through our focus groups with students that the textbook selection was not only about knowledge. We often think about books as a source of knowledge, but rather these textbooks produced relationships and surprises in our curriculum that really were about kind of the reality that got produced in the classroom, the relationships, as well as the knowing. The next article that you have as a suggested reading also came from my work with Becky and the focus groups with graduate students. And we often, those of us who teach about research and research design, often talk about paradigms. And often that is a source of uncertainty and unclarity for our students. What is a paradigm? How do I know which one I'm supposed to be in? Can I change my paradigmatic perspective over time? And so we spent this article really thinking about how we introduce and teach about paradigms. And we drew upon Karen Berard's writing, their philosophical writing on space, time, and matter to think about the teaching of paradigms. And so one thing on the next slide, if we go to the next slide, is the article is that we really wrote around is the notion of time, not only our planning time as instructors, but also our weekly time in the classroom and how our decisions in those ways influenced how students understood paradigms. Also the space, so not only the physical space, and you can see here an image on the right of our classroom. We had about 20 or 25 bodies crammed into this very small space. And so that produced certain relationships and types of learning in the classroom. Also our dialogical space and how we were intentional to organize students in small groups and partnerships, and the uncomfortableness that produced, but also the generative conversations that came. And then the last would be about matter. We write a lot about matter, and the image on the left there you can see is actually a doctoral student's thinking with a theory that she had been reading, as well as data from a transcript and an interview, and how this working with materials produced new ideas for her as a scholar. All right, and so just to end today, I want to just give a little highlights from the book, Speculative Pedagogy of Qualitative Inquiry. You can see the table of contents here. There's a photo of Becky. We went to Cape Town, South Africa, and did some workshops and presentations around this book for the Feminist New Materialist Conference. And just to highlight the book itself, the table of contents here, I'm going to talk more about chapters 1 and 2 in a moment, but chapters 3, 4, and 5 are really kind of the big ideas. When we started looking at focus group conversations over maybe 3 or 4 year period with doctoral students, the notion of trust, navigating and negotiating, and intervening kind of came up as the really big themes and ideas that we heard our doctoral students talking about, and the ways that they were learning about being a qualitative inquirer. So on the next page, or sorry, the next slide, Catherine, you'll see my own thinking here illustrated on what's called a concept map. On the left, this map, you'll see in the middle the word inquiry. When I went to Cape Town in 2017 for a research partnership with a colleague there, we had co-taught a class together for a week. And one of the co-instructors asked each of us to choose one word to think with over the week. And she called it forceful concept mapping, because she invited us to think with ideas and concepts that might not seem to fit or go along with the word that was in the middle of our map. And you can see over time on the right that my thinking about inquiry, spelled I-N-Q-I-R-Y, shifted to thinking about inquiry in a different way, which was really the catalyst for our whole book project together. So on the next slide, you will see what Becky and I call re-etymologizing. We articulate this as our inquiry practice, where we kind of muse on definitions and of words, their origins and histories, not in a quest to find an answer, but to rather is the process of searching for definitions that our thinking is undone and newness about a concept or word is produced. And so for us, we thought a lot about this word inquiry. We looked up the definition, we pulled the different parts of the word apart, and we began to think with how our students were talking about inquiry from our focus group conversations with them. And so on the next slide, you'll see an example of what became for us. Inquiry became inquiry, spelled in this way, which we talk about in the opening chapters of the book. And then we come to conceptualize inquiry as uncertain, restful, relational, and liveliness. And these 4 concepts are really threaded throughout the entire book when we explore the notion of trusting, navigating, and negotiating, as well as intervening. And so we really spend this book thinking about what is inquiry, and can it even be taught? And so that's the question that really guided our thinking throughout the book. And then we end the book on the next slide, with just some questions, and I'll pose these for you all today as well. So our invitation is, if uncertain, restful, relational liveliness is always already inquiry, then how can we foster spaces for students to engage in these practices? And how can we engage with that uncertain, restful, relational liveliness within our own research or inquiry practices? And so these might be questions that we explore today. And so before we open to a Q&A, I do also want to just share a few resources with you if you have students that are interested in thinking and learning more about how different post-philosophies inspire our own work as inquirers. One you'll see here is a webinar website. You can find it on the Mizzou webpage. You'll see on the left is a current webinar series that's partnered with the University of Western Cape, as well as the University of Ghent in Belgium. And we're exploring this topic of doing higher education differently in conversation with neuroatypicality. And then on the right there, you'll see another art graphic for a webinar series that has concluded, but you can still find all of the recorded sessions on our YouTube channel, Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. We interviewed 14, we had 14 sessions, some had more than one panelist that were across the globe from many different countries over the course of the pandemic, actually. And we asked them about which philosophies inspire your research practices, how does it shape your methodological choices, and then how do you help mentor and prepare graduate students in the academy who are engaging in some of these newer post-qualitative ways of thinking about inquiry. And there are also suggested readings that get paired with each of the webinars, and people have found them quite helpful in the courses that they're teaching with students. The last slide here is based on a new series from Routledge. I'm one of the co-editors. Karen Murris from Finland is the main editor, and there's also a website that accompanies this new book series. These two book images are the first two books in the series, and the first is really just an introduction to the series called Navigating the Post-Qualitative, New Materialist and Critical Posthumanist Terrain Across Disciplines, authored by all of the editors of the series. And then the purple one there is a glossary. So what we have found is that students, as they engage in different philosophical writings, there's a lot of new words and new concepts for them. And so this is a glossary, quite an interactive glossary with different concepts that come from new materialist, critical posthumanist research traditions. And the website there is a curated space for this new series that has pedagogical examples and ways and resources that you might think about teaching about post-qualitative research in your courses. So I'm going to end there. I think that gives us around 15-20 minutes if we would like to open up for questions and discussions, Catherine, and happy for you to help me moderate those and think together as a collective here today.
Thank you, Candace. Having read the sources that you recommended in advance of today's session, I know a number of my students and colleagues here on the meeting have had a chance to play with some of those ideas a bit. And even still, I just found, again, anytime I've heard you speak in the past, ideas that really challenge what I thought I understood, ways I thought I was going about my work. While we wait for people to add some questions in here, I wondered if you would play just a minute with one of those binaries that you hinted at in your session, because I think it's of interest to a lot of the people that are here today. Sort of the binary that we've created between quantitative and qualitative.
Yeah, that's a great one to think with. So for me, I think I'm still in my understanding or trying to learn about what is this whole idea of binaries and resisting them mean or do. And the one that you shared, I think, is one that for many of us in the academy, we hear a lot. We probably used it a lot ourselves when we talk about on either quant or qual. And perhaps mixed methods was an effort for people to resist that binary. I think for me, in my reading of these philosophies, it's not that we're ever going to eradicate or get rid of the binaries. There are specific or distinct assumptions or aspects that make quantitative possible and make qualitative research possible. But I think it's that in thinking about the relationship between the two, or what might be generative when we think them together. And while we think them together, it doesn't mean that we're not attentive to how they're very different, but the difference in what gets produced in thinking them together might offer us something new to think about inquiry. So I think for me, that's kind of the broader way that I think about this notion of resisting binaries. Another example from my work is just this whole idea of writing and what is literacies. I think when we define writing as alphabetic, it might not make thinkable or possible some of these other literacies that we saw children engage with in the classroom. So what instead of, and so the teacher, Tara, would often say, like, I need to be teaching them alphabetic writing, and they need to know how to spell, they need to know how to write an essay. But at the same time, there were some beautiful literacies that came to be when they were invited to think about literacies in other ways. And so over time, we've come to see that it's not an either or. It's not that we either need alphabetic or we need kind of multimodal, artistic, and digital literacies. We actually need them together. And we found that students used alphabetic literacies when it made sense, or multimodal when it made sense, and oftentimes in tandem with each other. And so perhaps that's what we can think about also with quantitative and qual, is that if we want to think about the ways we inquire in the world, there might be times that we think them together. And that helps us to explore inquiries and questions that we have about the world.
Thank you. Are there others that would like to wave or signal in some way that you have a question that you'd like to ask?
I guess I'll ask. Well, hi, I'm Gary Ritter, and
Hi, Gary.
and I'm interested to learn about this. And thanks for being flexible with us and our students, faculty, with today's weather. We're all looking out the window, wondering how sleety it's going to be. We've got a few graduate students on board here in curriculum instruction who, aspire to do the exact kind of work that you're doing. And I wonder about kind of words of wisdom for this, or suggestions, guidance, whatever you can offer. I mean, we're doing our best to mentor them here, but the more words of wisdom, the better.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. That's part of the reason why we created the webinar series called Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry, was to really make transparent and demystify kind of the struggles and tensions of trying to navigate the academy, thinking with theories or philosophies that might not be traditional or dominant in one's field of study. That can be quite scary, and it can be hard. And there's lots of politics, to the doing of inquiry when it comes to tenure and promotion, manuscripts for publication, et cetera. So I think I would encourage students, one is maybe to watch some of those recordings, because we have 14 different panelists who really give advice on how they think about mentoring and advising. So I think some things come to mind is, I hope as faculty ourselves, maybe I'll talk to us first, is that to be open to the otherwise. And so if you're serving on a dissertation committee, working with a student, they might want to do something that's new or different than what you're most comfortable or most knowledgeable about. So I think the invitation for us is to welcome our own learning through the work of our students. And then for the students, I think a lot of it is, sometimes it's harder to do this work because they almost have to be pedagogical in how they talk to their committee members. And so it might take a lot more reading and preparation to say, I want to do this study, here's my inquiry, and I want to approach it this way. I'm not quite sure what's going to unfold during the inquiry, but here's the reading and the understandings I have about the concepts that I want to think with from this particular theorist or philosopher. And inviting the committee, will you go on this journey with me? And that can be quite scary for a student to do, I think. So to me, it goes back to relational pedagogies within a grad student and an advisor relationship. Is there a space of trust and relationality that allows for both to be learners in that case, even within the structures of power of the academy and institution that we know committee members have? So I guess the other would be for them to choose their committee members wisely. Make sure if they plan to go on a journey that might be quite different than what's the norm in that space, that they have some open conversations to see what might be possible and where those limits or boundaries might be within that committee and that institution. So those would be my first thoughts, Gary.
Thank you very much.
Somebody else want to signal with a question?
Hi, Dr. Kuby.
Yeah.
Hi.
It's good to see you again.
I know, I saw your name and I was like, glad you're here.
Yes, ma'am. And I've really enjoyed all that you've shared. I want to ask you about your questions. What is literacy and writing? And you talked about them as questions tied to ethics and justice. And I'm wondering, people talk about them in such reductive ways, and everyone thinks that we have it figured out, right? So what are some of the starting points to kind of coalesce around some aspects of it that you think would bring us closer to an understanding that would better support our students? I feel like that was kind of a lot in a little bit. So if you can make sense of that.
I'll try my best. If I'm not answering it, feel free to interrupt and direct me again. So I think about a piece that I didn't share as the suggested reading, but some of my newer pieces with Tara really have engaged on a deeper exploration of the ethics and justice of some of these philosophies that might not be labeled as like critical or social justice on the surface, so to speak. I think some of the writings around Indigenous philosophers, Indigenous theorists, as well as several Black feminist scholars have really been where I've spent my time reading and thinking, specifically some Black feminist scholars who are building upon Crenshaw's work of intersectionality. But I forget the exact title of the book, but Jennifer Nash, for example, and Jasmine Puar are two women of color scholars who are thinking beyond intersectionality, and they're putting some of these concepts around identity and justice in relationship to different philosophies like Deleuze and Guattari, other poststructural. And so they're working them in tension, and they're seeing a very generative space for us to reimagine our world and our relationships. I'll just speak for myself. For me, my training at Indiana was very much in critical theories, critical literacy, critical pedagogy, and a lot of talk around, power, position, and privilege, and injustice in our world. And my own reading of a lot of those was about a future that may or may not come. It was about creating change for something in the future, which I think is needed. At the same time, what I think about in classroom spaces is we might often neglect the everyday realities of those spaces. And so if we're focusing on knowledge and skills that we hope is going to transform our students' lives in 5 or 10 years, while that is important, I don't want to create a binary. I think it also is important for us to consider our pedagogical moves in the moment and what do they make possible for children's everyday lives and realities. And so I feel like for me, that's where some of these philosophical perspectives have really helped me to understand the in the moment now and what are those ethical moves in a classroom. So for example, when Tara invited students to be writers with a range of artistic materials, students who hated writing, resisted writing, didn't ever want to engage in writing, found themselves doing it outside of school and at home. Their families were shocked at how they were engaged with text and materials. And so it allowed them to be literacy producers and consumers in ways that weren't happening in more traditional teaching practices. So to me, that is an ethical move. It's a way of thinking about students' identities, their histories, their languages, what they bring to a space. And if we don't create a boundary or border around how we define literacies in very narrowed ways, what can we imagine might be possible that we don't even know about yet in the moment? And so that's the ways that I think some of these philosophies are really helping me think about things that might be labeled as mundane, everyday interactions, to me, change the world. They change students' lives, they change their relationships, they change how they know and come to learn in the world. So I think it's a both and. I think we have to think about systems and larger structures. I think we also have to think about the everyday relationships and interactions and how both matter when we think about ethics and justice. So did that get to some of your question, Christina?
Yes, it did. And I would love to know the titles of the text that you did not include. If you could point me there, I appreciate it.
Do you mind just sending me an email reminder? I can put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to pass along some of those titles that I'm in the middle of trying to read and make sense of right now.
Thank you.
And Candace, if you send that to me, I'll make sure that everybody who's online gets it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Well. Thank you. Anyone else have a question? I can see some of you. There are others I can't see. If you want to wave or indicate in some way that you have a question.
I guess I'll go really quick.
Hi.
I guess going back to the quantitative and qualitative. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a PhD student. I liked in this one. I can't pronounce any of the stuff. Sorry.
The productive aporias, the one on paradigms. Yeah.
How you listen to the student voices about paradigming and about the kind of rigid way that they were reading about paradigms, and that each student should choose one paradigm and stick to it. And it just gave me permission to look again at all of the readings I've been doing about, you know, quantitative versus qualitative, and the paradigms of that. It's the language that's used is very much like people are either one of these or another, not approaches are either one of these or the other. And to me, that's like very rigid. And I came up with a joke, and KMP said she chuckled. So I'm going to see if you're going to give me a pity chuckle. But you know the joke, there are two kinds of people in the world, those who can count and those who can't. All right, so here's my follow-up joke. There are two kinds of people in the world: quantitative researchers, qualitative researchers, and mixed methods researchers. Thank you for your pity chuckle. But just that, like, there's like, you are either one of these, unless you're not, you know, like, and I don't know, like, if you could speak more into, like, for grad students, as we try to, like, in our dissertations and stuff, like, declare our approach, how, like, what language can we use to, instead of like, I am this kind of person, and this is how I relate to the whole world in this one word.
Yeah, so I hear several really interesting things coming from your comments. So I think one, in case I forget, I'll say them both, but one is just about this notion of paradigms, and am I one, and do I stay in this box? And two, I think, is you're asking about the language of how we write about who we are as researchers and how that shapes our decisions that we're making in our research. Yeah, I think for us, myself and Becky, we were fascinated with, if you look at textbooks, how we put paradigms in tables and columns, but how students were finding more blurriness between them. And so I think for us, that notion of paradigming, like we write about, is that they are things. There are things, we have conceptualized them as a group of, you know, people in the academy. They have certain ways they're defined, but they're also doings. They're also active and alive, and we're constantly rethinking different paradigmatic assumptions. So I think one of the textbooks that was on my slide, the one by Saban, Baden, Howell Major, kind of the more traditional qualitative textbook, they have one page in that book that I found helpful for myself and for students. And they write about how different people in the academy approach paradigms in different ways. Some would say they're aparadigmatic. They don't have to have a paradigm, or atheoretical. Others would say that they choose their paradigm based on their research study and the questions they're asking. Others would say that they have one paradigm and they are stuck in that paradigm forever and always, like it's just who they are. So there's not even agreement in the academy on how we should think about paradigms, which is quite refreshing. And so I found that students then were able to write about it kind of in those ways. And students found themselves kind of falling in line in those different ways of thinking about paradigms. So I think, to answer your question about writing, it's where you are in the moment. I mean, as you're doing your dissertation, you might find yourself gravitating toward one or two paradigms at that point in time. But as you learn and read more, and as new paradigms are invented and come to be in the world, your thinking will change. And so I think that, you know, it's just committing to where you are in the moment in your thinking. And I think if you're pulling together two paradigms, or whether it's two theories that might seem incompatible and people might question, like, these can't go together, then I would encourage you to really write about how they are different. They are different in how they think about knowing or reality, but what you find generative in acknowledging those differences and working them together to help you explore the inquiry that you're engaging with.
Thank you, Carissa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kuby, for the insights that you've offered today. I've just been sitting here in awe of the articulate and referenced way that you are responding to these questions that you couldn't necessarily anticipate. And I think, again, that's a reflection of the reflective way you approach your own teaching. And I found that perhaps the most generative of the things that I read for today's sessions was your self-study as a teacher educator and or a research educator. And I'm taking a lot away from this session today on that topic, and looking forward to conversations with our colleagues across the School of Ed and the university. How do we prepare students to engage in thinking that cannot be put into a series of steps that you learn and follow?
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining us today. And it looks like everybody who's left is School of Education pretty much. And so you're invited to join us again at 4 o'clock this afternoon for a discussion, a small group informal conversation with Dr. Kuby about other related topics. If you're interested, you can email me and I'll send you the link. So thank you again. Join me in thanking her for being with us today. And just so many things to think about. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And we're in the same state, so perhaps our paths will cross again. Yeah, have a great rest of the day. Be safe, stay warm.
Bye all.